Hello, I'm Ellen Vince. Welcome to Impact, a podcast about how we can each bring about real change in the world and getting practical in making that happen.
And hello, I'm Clive Johnson. A special welcome if you're listening for the first time, and a big thank you to our new subscribers. Each week, we look at one aspect of how we can connect our hearts to offer healing for others with our collective intention, prayers, and meditation, and talk about the critical happenings in our world that need our attention right now, some of which may not be making the headlines where you are.
So let's take a look at what we've picked up from the news this week and see where we might hone in with our prayers and intentions. As we record, it's March 6th, 2024. And the first story we would like to start with, we're going to go over to Haiti. We've reported a few times about what's going on there, so we're returning there. We're keeping a close eye on what's happening. Gun battles raged in a number of locations of the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince, last Thursday, and that led to the death of at least 4 police officers and police stations being set on fire. Gunfire was also directed at Haiti's main international airport, while schools, universities, and businesses have been forced to close. A prominent gang leader said multiple factions were gathering to launch attacks on state security forces in a move to remove Prime Minister Ariel Henry, who has promised to step down. Haiti's security and political crisis is intensifying, and armed groups have seized control of large swaths of the country in the recent years, while thousands have also protested in the streets, demanding that the prime minister step down. Henry is currently in Kenya finalizing a deal to strengthen Haiti's police forces, and we reported on this last week. On this weekend, Haiti's government declared a 72-hour state of emergency on Sunday following the storming of a major Port-au-Prince prison by armed gangs, killing at least 12 people and allowing about 3,700 inmates to escape. A government statement said that another prison in nearby Croix des Bouquets was also stormed over the weekend. In response to the escalating violence, the U.S. has urged its citizens to leave the country. So this is really ramping up, and I have to admit, I don't know why they want Henry to leave office. I would like to understand that a little more, and maybe at some point, as we've talked about doing, Clive, we could take a deeper dive into this and understand it a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. It will really help us to understand more what's going on there. Not unusual when a leader is out of a country that trouble happens, unfortunately.
Right.
That can be coups, it can be real trouble, as is the case here. And I don't know, I haven't actually followed up on this, but what actually happened in Kenya, whether that agreement to strengthen the forces has gone through, and whether it's going to be adequate in order to combat this huge security situation. So
and as we reported previously, they have 10,000 police officers for, was it 10 million people?
Exactly. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And yeah, it seems an almost impossible task for them against the strength of the gangs, which are in control of essentially large parts of the country, as I understand it. So yes, we do really need to understand more, but as you say, this is really not moving in the right direction. Let me correct myself. I'm not meant to say... One of the principles of intention is stay above politics.
Well, it's
having a view of solution, isn't it? But it's moving in a concerning direction. I think we can say that, can't we? In terms of the violence ramping up.
Well, we definitely want to hold the people who are being held with the 72-hour state of emergency and are being told to stay home. And, I think schools are closed.
Yes.
And I'm sure there's a lot of fear.
Yes, there must be. Well, moving to another region where there is unease at the moment, and this is for many people perhaps a little known region. I didn't know about it until quite recently. Transnistria, which is located between Ukraine and Moldova. It's the southern border of Ukraine with Moldova, small European country of Moldova. It's actually a part of Moldova. But it's a region where there seems to be almost a 50-50 split, as far as I can tell, between people who want to reunite with Russia, as was the case when they were a Soviet republic, or Moldova was part of the USSR. Gennady Shioba, apologies for pronunciation as always, who is an opposition figure in Transnistria, recently suggested, according to reports, that separatists may call for a referendum on the region's annexation to Russia. So this is kind of an echo of what went on in Crimea back in 2014. The narrow strip of land bordering southern Ukraine is home to about close to 500,000 people, is internationally recognized as being part of Moldova, but is backed by Russia. The Congress of Deputies at all levels in the region's capital did pass a resolution seeking Moscow support to prevent an apparent economic crisis, which they blame on Moldova. So this is like the regional state government really being in conflict with its own national government. Moldovan authorities at the national level have dismissed its demand as a propaganda move, downplaying recent events and saying there is no risk of escalation. Now, this was interesting to me. I didn't realize this. There are about 1,500 Russian troops stationed in the Strip. So if you look at a map, as I say, this is on kind of the southwest side of Ukraine. So there is another potential front for Ukraine and Russia in that war. Russia, having access through Belarus, kind of very much to the north and to the east, and having these positions to the south of the country as well. And not too far away, it has to be said, from the Black Sea. The Russian aggression in Ukraine has also impacted negotiations, said a government spokesman in Moldova, saying it is currently impossible to hold meetings since two of its very important actors, in other words, Ukraine and Russia, can't sit at the same table for negotiations. The matter is very polarizing in the region. There are some Transnistrians reportedly where they have different views, even within a family, who essentially aren't talking to each other. So really quite an uneasy situation in this particular region that could, who knows, lead to a referendum. Mm-hmm. Really another one we will be keeping our eyes on.
Yeah. Listeners, in full disclosure, I asked Clive to take this story because I didn't really understand it and I hadn't even been aware of this region. So thank you for explaining it in a way that I can start to understand it, and hopefully our listeners can too.
Yeah, as I say, I didn't until quite recently. I actually had an interest a while back in potentially going to Moldova when the war started. And it was almost, I looked at this, it was one of these aid charities that you essentially sponsor yourself to go. You pay. It's almost like this is where I ended up with it. It was going to be like probably doing more to appease my conscience than I'd actually give help. Being there for two weeks and demanding training and not bringing very much and needing a translator all the time to. So, and actually quite expensive. So in the end, I decided actually my efforts are going to be much better spent in intention sending and prayer and kind of remotely. But yeah, I did take quite an interest in Moldova and at the time became aware of this region. But it's off the radar of most of us,
yes.
I think.
Yes, it certainly is. And I'm interested in continuing to learn more. So thank you for bringing it to our attention. So a senior official with UNICEF has appealed for wider and safer humanitarian access in Gaza, where unfortunately malnourished babies are slowly dying while we watch this happen. Adele Coder, hopefully that's the correct pronunciation, she's the regional director for the Middle East and North Africa for UNICEF. She said in a statement issued on Sunday that reports from the region say that at least 10 children have died from dehydration and malnutrition at Kamal Adwan Hospital in the north of Gaza in recent days, which is one of the few remaining hospitals in the enclave. She warned that there are probably more children fighting for their lives, and perhaps even more in the north who cannot access care at all. She said parents and doctors must feel an unbearable sense of helplessness and despair when they realize that life-saving aid just a few kilometers away is being kept out of reach. But worse still are the anguished cries of the babies slowly perishing under the world's gaze, she said. The lives of thousands more babies and children depend on urgent action being taken now.
This is a story that I can't imagine anyone can't be moved by. You know, whatever your circumstance, whether you've been a parent, a mother, it is so desperate, isn't it, this situation?
Yes.
And thinking about probably many orphans there as well, and the babies crying, my goodness.
Yes. And the hungry. Those children who are hungry. And so lots of intention, love, energy sent toward this issue, and that the powers that be who can help are moved to do so. Definitely.
I almost feel uncomfortable moving to a good news story after this, but let's take a moment to appreciate there are some good things going on. To Uganda, an increasing need for agricultural land and illegal logging has contributed to massive loss of forest in Uganda's forests. We often talk about the Amazon, don't we, but not so much about what's going on in Africa, with wood being used to produce charcoal, which is an important source of fuel and heating, being one of the main culprits. The rate of deforestation threatens the very future of what is a very important rainforest in that whole region, the so-called Great Lake. Is it Great Lakes or Five Lakes? I can't remember. The Lakes region in Central Eastern Africa, the Mabira rainforest. One initiative that is helping to stem the trend is using waste to make charcoal. Waste from homes, things that rubbish, trash, switching from wood to food scraps. The Uganda Women's Water Initiative, UWWI, is training women how to make charcoal briquettes, saving them both time to walk long distances looking for firewood, and also being totally free. Mixing vegetables, carbs, and proteins offers what they call a balanced diet for the charcoal briquettes, which also burn slower than wood charcoal, meaning less is needed to cook more. But the process for making these briquettes is apparently very simple. So it definitely sounds like a win-win for people and the environment. And we'll put a link to the Uganda Women's Water Initiative website in our show notes.
Yeah, and this is one of those stories where you just go, yes!
Exactly. Exactly.
Yay! We're figuring it out.
We are.
I can only imagine for these women not having to walk or, find, and it's free.
Yeah. And the walks, they do walk for absolutely miles very often to do this. And the burden of carrying firewood back and everything, it's very, very time consuming and wearisome. So from that point of view as well, it's very positive.
Maybe this can be used somewhere else besides Uganda.
Exactly. You'd imagine that it could be modeled. Yeah.
Let's hope so. So now a water-related story and a reminder that water is the focus this quarter for the Global Healing Response, an initiative that I began almost 20 years ago. And the theme for this year is Our Planet this quarter is water. So over to Mexico City, which is the most populous city in North America. I did not know that until I saw this in the show notes, is suffering a severe water crisis with drought and many months of low rainfall, pushing a heavily strained water supply system to the brink. More than 21 million residents across Mexico City metropolitan area have endured weeks of water shortages, many only receiving water on a weekly basis by tanker truck deliveries, and needing to constantly recycle the limited water they have. Hopefully they're doing that safely. Inadequate infrastructure for a growing population presents a particular challenge. Underground aquifers are becoming stressed, while years of overuse are causing the ground to sink at a rate of about 20 inches per year since 1950, according to a 2021 study co-authored by Solano Rojas. Reflecting global trends due to climate change, a recent report from Mexico's National Water Commission found that Mexico as a whole is seeing warmer and drier average temperatures, as many cities are, right, with climate change.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. So, my goodness, double problems there, aren't there? This creaking
Right.
infrastructure, the sinking aquifers, which are the main way of distributing water, as I understand it,
Yes.
and drought or
Yeah.
reservoirs running empty. A
Hmm.
nightmare to resolve. And apparently there have been protests already. Finger pointing around inadequate planning, I guess, long-term planning. As we mentioned before in the special episode we did for Global Healing Response quarter focus, water is a major
Hmm.
cause potentially of conflict. And yeah, it's
And in that episode, we talked about, some people think the crisis is really going to hit a high by 2030,
yeah,
which is only 6 years away. And when you
yeah,
hear stories like this, you understand why.
yes. Well, 20 inches a year is very significant, isn't it?
Yes.
This
Yes.
and these are incredibly complex, long-term, expensive capital projects, as I understand it, to replace or
Hmm.
shore up. So again, where does the money come from to do that? And where is the time? Is it going to be adequate before 2030? If that's kind of the forecast, as it were, for really coming to major total destruction.
Well,
I
let's hope
think,
the same innovators who did the briquettes in Uganda can come up with a
yeah,
solution in Mexico City.
let's hope so. My goodness, yeah, my goodness. It's very hard when you're in such a densely populated city as well, isn't it? And so
Mhm.
spread out.
Mhm.
If it was a much smaller contained area, you can imagine it probably, even though it will be complicated and expensive, something could be put in place much more quickly. Not good news, I'm afraid. This caught my attention earlier this week to West Africa, a country we have mentioned before, Burkina Faso. About 170 people were killed in attacks on 3 villages in northern Burkina Faso last week, according to regional prosecutor Ali Benjamin Koulibaly. The attacks occurred in the villages of Kosilga, Nodin, and Soro in Yatenga province on the 25th of February last week, and the death toll is still provisional. Separate deadly incidents on the same day targeted a mosque and a church in different parts of the country, and at the church, at least 15 civilians were killed in those attacks. I don't know about the mosque. I didn't pick up on casualties there. Large parts of Burkina Faso are controlled by armed groups. Close to 20,000 people and more than 2 million people have been displaced in this desperately poor country in recent years. Instability prompted 2 military coups back in 2022. Now we're splitting out news reviews from our more in-depth news briefings, interviews, and other topics covered in our other episodes. We'll make a note to put together a news briefing episode on what's going on in Burkina Faso and that whole area, the Sahel area in West and Central Africa very soon, because there have been many coups in different countries and a lot of instability. And when I heard this story, it really took me back immediately to the invasion by Hamas in Israel back in October, where hundreds of hostages were taken by armed rebels. Here's a story of armed rebels attacking 3 villages, not taking hostage and kidnapping, but executing 170 people. And I for sure didn't hear this mentioned amongst the headlines in the UK news.
Yeah, neither. And I haven't heard it in the US either. Yeah.
So important we don't turn our attention away from it, I think.
Right. Exactly. So staying in West Africa, where there's instability, Nigeria's National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, announced on Sunday that it was increasing security at its facilities amid cases of attacks on its warehouses. Nigeria is facing one of its worst economic crises in years, with inflation rising to nearly 30% and the Nigerian naira falling to an all-time low against the dollar. So one of the country's most powerful trade unions launched protests last week demanding immediate measures to quell hunger by opening of all food storage silos across the country. The strengthening of security follows a break-in to steal maize from a facility in the capital, Abuja. Oh.
Nigeria is, absolutely a massive population in West Africa, the most populous country in West Africa, I believe, facing this huge food crisis and real instability. So again,
and 30% inflation.
Exactly. So my goodness, we have to really hope and intend for a turnaround there. Situation now that you may have heard of in the news. In South Korea, there has been a strike recently by trainee doctors and newly qualified doctors, I believe, who've walked out over proposed healthcare reforms that are aimed at increasing enrollments to medical schools. Those striking, and they are in their thousands, have refused to return to work, defying a government deadline to end their strike or face legal action. The local Yonhap news agency reported last Thursday, which was the day of this deadline, that most of those striking showed little sign of returning to the hospitals. And this was as the Vice Health Minister, Park Min-soo, confirmed that only 294 of more than 9,000 trainee doctors had returned to work, saying that he sought talks with them, and I don't know quite what the progress has been there. The South Korean government is accused of intimidation tactics by the Korean Medical Association, while senior health ministry official Kim Chung-hun said that starting this Monday, the government would notify doctors who didn't return to work that it plans to suspend their license. And the law in that country allows the government to order doctors back to work if it sees grave risks to public health. Those who refuse to comply with such orders can have their licenses to practice suspended for up to a year, and they can face 3 years in prison or a very significant $22,000 fine. The issue isn't an easy one to resolve. The government says it's aiming to add up to 10,000 new doctors by 2035 to help cope with the country's fast aging population. Officials say that South Korea's doctor-to-population ratio is one of the lowest among industrialized countries. On their side, the protesting doctors say that the universities aren't ready to provide adequate education for so many students, and the government should first be addressing pay and working conditions before trying to increase the number of physicians. The strike has understandably caused disruption in many hospitals, causing appointments and surgeries to be postponed. It has strong echoes of what's been going on in the UK over the last year or so. Doctors and nurses striking, largely over pay and conditions, but also this problem that governments in many countries are facing about retaining medical staff that have gone through often very expensive training and providing for an aging population that probably is going to put much stronger demands on the health services. So it is quite a difficult one to resolve. And here in the UK, the issue is more with doctors and nurses leaving the profession, many going overseas, as it were, an open market once they have certainly a degree of experience. So it is a bit of a headache. I don't think you can understand perhaps both sides here.
Exactly. That was my thought. I understand both of them. Too bad they just can't work together to come up with a solution. And in the States, we have the same problem too. Not enough doctors to go around. So this seems like to be a global issue. And
I'm certainly here in the UK, and I'm sure it probably is the case in South Korea as well. The doctors and the nurses who are very sincere and they go into the profession very often motivated by the desire to help people. They're not interested in so much in the material aspects. They work very hard. Huge demands put upon them. They don't want to strike, ultimately. It kind of is almost the last resort, they feel, when they come to that point. So this is, quite a serious issue, I think.
Yeah, representative of what's going on everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, so over to Kazakhstan. An earthquake hit there in the city of Almaty on Monday, causing people to scurry for safety, of course. According to Kazakhstan's emergencies ministry, the magnitude 5 quake was also felt in Bishkek, the capital of neighboring Kyrgyzstan. The Astana Times reported mass evacuations of residents, and the Kazakh Emergency Situations Ministry said in a statement that the epicenter of the earthquake was recorded 31 kilometers or 19.2 miles south of Almaty and at a depth of 10 kilometers, 6.2 miles. At the time of our recording, casualties and damage resulting from the quake were being ascertained. So we're not quite sure how bad or after effects what's happened.
No, it did sound as though the response had been very effective, as far as I can tell, and that people had heeded the warnings very often, but absolutely it's not clear what the outcome has been. So some general reflections on these stories. Let's will for a way forward, especially in Transnistria, that all who have influence both there and also in Moldova, Moscow and Ukraine will be moved to recognize actions to resolve disagreement among its people over aligning with Russia that may maintain peace in the region. Let us also will for insight into a way forward towards peace and stability in Burkina Faso. And keeping our attention turned to the challenges facing many governments, let's will that the Haitian government will have wisdom to know how to act in response to the escalating violence in their country, and that the government in South Korea, as we've just been talking about, will be similarly guided in its response to the junior doctors' strike. Let us pray or hold intention for those authorities struggling with the continued impacts of climate change, for wisdom to allow equitable food provision in Nigeria and water supply in Mexico City, and for the emergency services in Kazakhstan to be guided to where best to direct their resources and energies to ensure the maximum benefit for human life.
May it be so. And finally, a good news story to end with. Trees are stalling the impacts of global warming in the eastern U.S. thanks to massive reforestation efforts. Despite a trend of rising temperatures across most of the U.S. and the world, as we've talked about today, scientists have noticed a pocket of much cooler air temperatures in the eastern part of the country, where temperatures have stayed relatively the same or even cooled down. A new study found that this is largely the result of wide-scale reforestation efforts following the deforestation that came with European settlement in the U.S. in the last century. More than 5 million hectares of forest area have been planted by the U.S. government, enough to cover an area bigger than England, Clive. Satellite and weather station data gathered throughout the last century found that the reforested areas had a massive cooling effect, mostly within 400 meters of the replanted trees, cooling the eastern U.S. by 1 to 2 degrees Celsius or 1.8 to 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit every year, and 2 to 5 degrees Celsius or 3.5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit on the hottest days of summer. That's impressive.
It is. And it's way above, isn't it, the targets that COP has, I think, for by 2030 for reducing global temperatures. So, yeah, it just shows you that we know this, don't we? And everybody knows this. Looks into the climate change, the power of the trees and the forests. Against that story we had earlier, albeit with the good news story of the initiative with the using waste for charcoal burning, but deforestation in Africa, this is really a wonderful story. And what a massive, massive area this is. 5 million hectares. Wow. I don't know what that is in square miles. But
I don't either. I'm not familiar with that, but I'll look it up.
But an area bigger than England, well, that gives you an idea.
Yes. And it isn't often I get to say, yay, US. So
Definitely on this one, I think.
That's a good story. Mm-hmm.
Definitely. So from what we've covered this week, our suggested main focus to hold as our intention between this episode and next week, focusing on the appalling crisis continuing in Gaza, where babies are dying of malnutrition. This is something that's really pulled at our heartstrings this week. And we suggest holding as our weekly intention, we will, that all who have influence in permitting and distributing aid to Gaza will be moved by the cries of malnourished babies in the region who are perishing under their gaze. And as always, we'll include this intention in our show notes.
That about wraps it up for this episode. Remember, you can connect with us in the Facebook group and for live intention holding in Clive's daily Insight Timer offerings, and with me in the Labyrinth Activist Network's Zoom calls. Details of how to hook up with these are in our show notes. Look out, too, for our next special topic episode, which we'll be releasing in the next few days. Thank you for listening and for sharing with us and holding intentions. We look forward to connecting again next time. And in the meantime,
thank you, go well, stay safe.
And remember, we're more powerful together.
Impact is presented by Ellen Bintz and Clive Johnson and produced by Impact Productions. Our theme music is by Chris Collins and our logo artwork is by Auto Classic. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or your favorite podcast provider. We're a non-commercial podcast dedicated to people of any faith tradition or none who yearn for healing in our troubled world. Please pass on the word so others may join us in making an impact. Thank you for listening.